Good evening, welcome to my channel. I'm Dr. Paul Kiritsis, and today I'm going to be continuing on with the discussion on Western alchemy and its the assimilation of ideas from Hellenistic philosophy. So as Midna-born poet Homer, who lived about 850 BCE, stayed faithful to the Egyptian conception, describing the primordial substance as river ocean, a deep and mighty flood encircling land and sea like a serpent, with its tail in its mouth. A pictogram of this image would appear much later in an 11th century Hellenistic manuscript together with the slogan En topan, the notion that everything is one. Thales, who lived between 630 and 546 BCE, on the other hand, visualized a flat earth floating atop a base substance which resembled a vast and desolate ocean. He too aligned himself with a view put forth by the Egyptian creation myths and Homer. A pupil of his, Anaximander of Miletos, who lived between 610 and 546 BC, called it the apiron, a term which means boundless, and recalls the mutability of water. Anaximenes, so he lived between 584 and 528 BC, also of Miletos, was the first philosopher to initiate a departure from the established convention, visualizing the base substance of the cosmos as a kind of vapor or air, but not of the physical type. Meditating on the problem at hand, he reasoned that condensation of the primal substance produced physical air, water and earth, while its rarefaction produced fire. His emphasis on transformation of one substance into another formed the foundation of Empedocles of Acragas. So he lived between 490 and 430 BCE. His doctrine of the elements, which was henceforth absorbed into Aristotle's nature philosophy. Of all pre-Socratic philosophers, he was a contemporary of Anaximenes in Heraclitus of Ephesus, who was around 535 to 475 BCE, that probably came closest to what many contemporary esotericists believe to be true. Seeing that the active mover behind the rotation of the elements is fire, it made sense to him that the underlying cause of all phenomena must be an ethereal fire of sorts. In his instructional poem on nature, a philosophical work written in hexameter, Empedocles made an important contribution to Aristotelian nature science regarding the doctrine of the elements. Unlike the pre-Socratics, who believed that each element was a primary substance in its own respect, Empedocles posited that it was the prima materia that differentiated into the four substances or elements under the influence of the four auxiliary qualities. It should be evident that the four elements in question are not to be confused with the four corporeal manifestations of the same name. They are merely principles comprised of immutable corpuscles that enable the prima materia to take on innumerable guises whilst remaining fundamentally unchanged. Hence, many centuries afterward, the compressed summa or compendium of alchemical knowledge presented in the enigmatic Tabula Smaragdina, or the Emerald Tablet, under the aegis of the legendary Hermes Trismegistus, could staunchly claim that the stone's father is the solar orb, also fire or philosophical sulfur, and its mother, the lunar orb, also water or philosophical mercury. Conversely, the wind or air would be implicated as the womb which carried it, and the volatile and moist humus, that is earth, would be cast in the presiding role of the wet nurse. In the aforementioned cosmogony, fire, an active masculine principle with a propensity to rise, is dry and hot. Air, also an active masculine principle but with a tendency to expand, is hot and wet. Alternatively, the feminine passive principle of water is wet and cold because of its inherent nature to expand and drop, whilst earth, also of the same cut as water but characterized by a condition of solidity that causes it to drop towards the navel of the earth, is cold and dry. Each element shares a secondary quality with two others, aligning them into an eternal cycle known as elemental rotation, where a succeeding condition is potentially latent in an existing one. As had been posited by Heraclitus, the only active mover in the assembly is fire, an element whose physical constituent spurs the protean transformation of chemical water from a liquid to a gas, and whose absence enables its transition back into a liquid and a solid. By this virtue, it made perfect sense to the ancient alchemists that the underlying cause of phenomena, the manifestations of the noumenal world, as well as the inner workings of Mother Nature, whose ways could be observed through chemical processes like calcination, coagulation, distillation, sublimation, and dissolution, could all be attributed to the subtle action of fire. This of course brings us to the genius of Plato. In following century-old premises brooded upon by the Ionic pre-Socratics, Plato borrowed the vision of the world as a living creature, along with Anaximenes' vision of the first cause as an ethereal fire, and married them with Pythagorean mystical insights that defined the first cause in strictly qualitative and geometric terms. If the uncreated was a spherical speck of light or fire which mysteriously took on a plethora of forms when it differentiated into other substances and qualities, and if everything that had been created was interconnected and infused with the same life force which emanated from the primeval time origin, then the obvious deduction would be to conceive of reality as being twofold. Somewhere out there existed a world of eternal ideas, forms, and archetypes that stood apart from and underpinned the visible world of becoming or created nature. Time and space, qualities of the latter, separated the two dimensions. Further speculations were then made within the framework of an animistic ontology, placing the earth under the mediation of a universal soul, so a psyche, which united the human soul in its virginal state with the web of the cosmic animal that was nature. The latter is a philosophical shard that blatantly recalls the famous Hermetic adage, as above, so below. Both the universal and the human psyche were superior and inferior reflections of a universal spirit, or nous, that stood above them on a cosmological totem pole and espied the first cogitation, a benevolent and primal act of self-love that was God. Directly beneath the universal soul was the earth, and below that the formless ili, or prima materia. Western alchemy would use logic proceeding from the threefold hypostasis of the Platonic cosmos to forge connections between the sickly metals of the mineral realms and the chaotic human soul seeking unio mystica with the Godhead, both having to be purged of their sickness and restored to an original state of perfection if the true essence of spirit in all its glory, so for example gold, was going to shine through. In hindsight, it appears that alchemy's theoretical deduction of the existence of God, the animistic context through which it operates, the idea of a transcendental realm, the relationship between macrocosm and microcosm, and much of its terminology derive explicitly from Platonic metaphysics. At this point, it should also be mentioned that Neoplatonic philosophy exerted a profound influence on practical aspects of the alchemical process, though it wasn't until the 16th century that manuscripts circumscribing this confluence came to light. Strictly speaking, the Neoplatonic Cosmos was merely a system of orthodox Platonism. Platonism that congealed under Plotinus, a Greek-Egyptian from the Deltaic Lycopolis in Lower Egypt. His closest disciple and biographer, the Lycian-born Porphyry, who lived between 232 and 305 CE, consolidated and amplified a cosmological system whereby the ether-filled spheres of the 7 planets and the 4 Empedoclean elements of the earth separated man from the empyrean of God and the primum mobile, an etheric substance which permeated space and facilitated the heavenly rotations. It's likely that the sevenfold astrological schema, through which incarnating souls picked up their rudimentary character traits, was extended to the corresponding metals. Hence, when alchemists relayed details of practical work, they could speak of it in a context of a 3 or 4 coloured division that was underpinned by a sevenfold schema. The Saturnine, jovial, and lunar forces lunarized the base matter by initiating chemical processes such as calcination, solution, and putrefaction, which brought about nigredo and albedo in the sealed vessel. Successful completion of the latter bestowed upon the alchemist the gift of the white stone, the power of healing and of transmuting base matter like lead or mercury into silver. Further operations were then carried out by the Venusian, Martian, and solar forces, which solarized the just-formed white stone through chemical reduction, sublimation, coagulation, and fermentation. These subsequent reactions in the sealed vessel or glass brought about citrinitas and rubido, culminating in the synthesis of a glittering red powder of significant weight known as the red stone. This was the ultima materia, or philosopher's stone, with the power to transmutate base metals into gold and impart immortality. The creation of the white stone under the aegis of the first 3 planetary powers comprised what alchemists termed the lesser work, and the creation of the red stone under the aegis of the last 3, the greater work. Mercury, a planet metal that would have comprised the preliminary stage, was never ascribed a definitive position in its own right because it was considered to be the formative force behind the entire alchemical opus. Perhaps the single most influential aspect of Hellenistic philosophy on alchemical theory was conferred by Plato's student Aristotle, who amplified the teleological concern of Platonic cosmogony. His hierarchical system of higher purposes tended to define created matter, an individual object or substance, in terms of four primary quotients, including the material, the formal, the efficient, and the final. The first two related to material composition and unique anatomical configuration. The third attempted to delineate the moving force behind it, whilst the fourth and last had to make do with the ultimate purpose for its existence, a principle that had been programmed into the individual object or substance by the Platonic prototype that existed in a higher essential world of forms and was itself a thought of God. According to Aristotle, everything that incarnated on the corporeal plane came equipped with a congenital nisus, an intrinsic desire to become the Platonic form existing in the empyrean of God upon which it had been modelled. In this eternal cycle of change, to be understood as a seesaw interaction between fiery activity or form and passive potentiality or ilir, the baby desires to become a fully grown human, the egg, a chicken, the seed a tree, the caterpillar a butterfly, and the element carbon a diamond. There were far-reaching implications for the mineral kingdom under the mediumship of such logic. Base metals weren't the monolithic, inert or dead reagents they appeared to be, but ensouled embryos in variant stages of gestation deep in caves and pockets of the earth that comprised the subterranean womb of the great mother goddess. Measured against gold, a metal which was perceived to be the material reflection of the immaterial, spiritual prototype of God, the other six known metals were essentially embryonic gold that had yet to ripen, a natural process which the alchemists sought to accelerate under artificially simulated conditions. We see a confluence of many pre-Socratic, Platonic and animistic ideas surrounding minerals and metals in Aristotle's Meteorologica. In this particular treatise, the Stagirite argues that the material occupying the space, so the primum mobile and the planetary spheres, wasn't the four earthly elements, but an indivisible, incorrupt, and previously unidentified fifth substrate known as ether, or the quintessence. This was one and the same with pneuma, or transcendental spirit. He also lays bare the proposition that the inhabitants of the subterranean kingdom all originated from exhalations of moist, watery vapour and dry, earthy smoke, deep in the loins of the earth. Those that could be dissolved, a category including gold and the imperfect metals, were comprised of the wet substrate, whilst those impermeable and resistant to change, like fossils and rocks, were creations of the dry one. When the Arab polymath Jabir Hayyan, who lived between 721 and 815, described the growth of metals in the Liber Misericordiae of the Corpus Jabirianum, which was written between the 8th and 10th centuries, some 11 centuries afterward, he connected the first of Aristotle's exhalations to sulfur, the active principle of flammability and combustibility, and the second to mercury, the principle of fusibility and volatility. Jabir believed that the shape and physiognomy of metals corresponded to two qualities that were incongruent to the two prevailing qualities of their internal matter. Each metal congealed under the aegis of a particular planetary power acting upon a marriage or conjunctionis between Mercury, consisting of the passive elements of water and earth, and sulfur, consisting of the active elements of fire and air. This was known as the sulfur-mercury theory, a model that will go on to dominate Western alchemy until the development of the phlogiston theory in the latter stages of the 17th century. Alternatively, in his renowned medieval alchemical treatise Summa Perfectionis, the Latin Geber, who lived about the 13th century, claims that occultation of the philosopher's stone was feasible because mercury was comprised of minute corpuscles that would induce transformation by diffusing through the perforated exterior of the base metal, an idea that was influenced by the Aristotelian idea of least parts as described in Physics and Meteorologica. The Stagirite speculations encompassed far-reaching consequences for the horrific art by strategically positioning it on a pedestal of eternal feasibilities that would precariously balance between poles demarcating the good and the evil, the genuine and the fraudulent, and the natural and the artificial for centuries to come. In his Physics, Aristotle differentiates between the artificial and the natural by illuminating the former's condition of inertness and the latter's proclivity towards motion and change. He then explicates the nature of mimesis by positing that artificial intervention on the part of the artist can either replicate the prototype or blueprint without changing its inner composition, or more importantly, accelerate the entelechyes of form matter or substances in ways which violate the teleological cycle. In his treatise Meteorologica, Aristotle uses verbs associated with the artificial activity of cooking like roasting and boiling to implicate that both the technical operations seeking to mimic natural processes and the natural processes themselves are reflections of one another, fundamentally the same. Over and beyond the fact that these words constitute women's work, a synthetic activity that was used to describe the synthesis of the philosopher's stone by Michael Mayer, who lived between 1568 and 1622, and some of the later alchemists, the couching of a natural process in artificial terminology betrays Aristotle's conviction that artificial methods could still generate a natural product. The first union between Greek nature philosophy and the proto-scientific technical recipes occurred during the life and times of Bolus the Democritian, an active Pythagorean who lived in the Deltaic Egyptian city of Mendes during the 2nd century BCE. Known for his mystical approach to the artisanal crafts, Bolus wrote a rather lengthy alchemical treatise entitled Physicacia Mystica, of which only segments have survived. While revealing a deep preoccupation with both the physical and paraphysical, Bolus's treatise delineates a process whereby a base metal or the prima materia, usually lead or mercury, is used to prepare gold, the great work, or philosopher's stone. In this, the earliest known prototype of metallic transmutation, transformation and exaltation of the stone is marked by 4 distinct phases of coloration that serve as exoteric markers of a deduction process instigated by the laws of cosmic sympathy and antipathy. Thus the stone, or noble metal, is confirmed form only after undergoing putrefaction through melanosis, or nigredo, bleaching through leucosis, or albedo, yellowing through xanthosis, or citrinitas, and finally reddening through iosis, or rubedo. Purple sometimes took the place of red in the last of these stages, hinting at the spiritual ennoblement bubbling directly beneath a chemical process which Bolus no doubt understood as changes to colour and properties that went beyond that of the superficial.